Thanks for joining us, Don, Lyle. I'm excited to kind of close this event off with two people who didn't pay $1 billion to invest in a team and whose paychecks aren't directly reliant on the success of the NBA. So we'll get a new kind of perspective here to close things out. And the first thing, I guess, to kind of kick it off, when we think about the health of the NBA right now, on one hand, we've spent kind of the whole day talking about valuations. They've kind of skyrocketed in the past 10 years, $2.5 billion average valuation. On the other hand, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Revenues are down 10%. We don't know exactly when fans are going to be back at arenas at scale or whether fans are going to want to come back in the same way. How do you guys think about right now kind of the health of the NBA overall?
I mean, for me, it's pretty easy. The 12-month health is challenged. The long-term health is not impacted. And, Don and I have been doing this for a while, and I think we probably each say to people looking to invest, you got to take a long-term horizon here. And if you think COVID is going to be here in 5-10 years, I think we're all in trouble beyond the NBA, right? And if you think that the vaccines are going to work and COVID will be in the rearview mirror, hopefully, then that long-term horizon, I think, makes it such that valuations aren't impacted. Now, is your P&L impacted in the short term? Sure. But I think the level of buyer we're talking about and the net worth of these buyers, they can overcome a short-term P&L impact.
Yeah, and just to add to what Lyle said, and the long-term interest is there, consumer interest is there. We saw it, I guess it was a week ago now, when half of Twitter was talking about whether light blue is a good color for James Harden, right? Like people are still very focused on the NBA, and while maybe they aren't going and buying hot dogs and beers at the stadium, the arenas, they still want to be involved. And in the long run, that means valuations. So when we do our discounted cash flows, 5 years from now, we're not thinking about COVID impact. It's not there.
About 8 months ago, the NBA started working with Dial Capital, kind of allowed them to start raising money to invest across a number of minority stakes and teams. To my knowledge, I don't believe they've raised a dollar yet. Are you surprised by that? And why do you think maybe the market hasn't shown up in that specific way, in a way that I think maybe some people thought it might have?
I think Lyle should answer that one.
I heard Ted point that out explicitly. Look, I think Dial is not a sports brand, and that could be why the NBA felt comfortable kind of anointing them as the first one to try this. I think sports as an asset class is an interesting question, but to think that you can invest in sports stakes without having experience in sports, I think they're finding out is probably a bit tougher. So, whether it's Arctos or some other competitors that'll come up, I think you'll see at the head of the house people who understand sports and are networked in sports. Now, why they can't raise the money besides that, it's interesting if you think you can get in at a discount. Sportico seems to think there's not a huge LP discount. How you exit and what that return looks like, I think, is a bigger question. Can the Dials and the Arctos of the world deploy capital? Certainly. Can they get out at an acceptable return? Question mark.
Yeah, I'd just add, to be fair, we are in a pandemic, and raising capital. It's one thing if you're raising capital and you're doing, fund 4 and you've had 3 successful funds, but for Dial, this is a new business line, so to speak. And so it's not surprising to me that they would run into some difficulties, trying to do it all via Zoom.
Totally. And Lyle, you mentioned, LP discounts as an idea. One of the things that Peter, who did these valuations for us, has said is that if you look across the 4 sports leagues, the difference between valuation for LP stakes and valuation for full stakes in the NBA is smaller. The gap is narrower there than it is in other leagues. As an example, the Hornets, I think last year, sold a stake with a valuation at $1.5 billion. That's pretty much exactly where Peter values them right now. Do you guys see a different? You work across all the leagues. Do you see a difference in the NBA and why that might be narrower here than it is in the NFL or Major League Baseball, or is that just a small sample size and not something to be made a big deal of?
I mean, but part is the size of the stake, right? So if you're looking, and I'll defer to Don because he was involved here, but if you're looking at a huge stake, whether it be the NFL or the NBA, I think there's a meaningful discount unless you can include governance with that stake at a level that makes it interesting. I think that discount begins to shrink the smaller the stake and or the bigger the governance. So if I'm selling 1% in an NBA team, I don't think there's a discount maybe. If I'm selling a 25% stake, I'm going to bet that there's a bigger discount. And I don't think that's unique to the NBA or the NFL. I think it's unique to the nature of league governance, and the fact that there's really one person who matters, right? And you try to put some bells and whistles on an LP stake, but at the end of the day, if there's a dispute and or a decision made, that's the control valuations.
Those bells and whistles being path to control, right of first refusal, things like that, or
yeah, I mean, yes, and these are becoming real businesses. You can put a board structure around it, and you can try to give people a real seat at the table. But unlike other industries, again, there is a controlling owner, and that has real teeth in it.
Yeah, everything Lyle said, I completely agree with. Not surprisingly, the only thing I'd add to it is that each of these situations is so unique, and that's the thing about professional sports and the franchises, that the ownership structures are unique. You've got lots of family dynamics. You've got a lot going on, and so the nature of the transactions are different, and so therefore you end up with different outcomes. And I think we have to be careful not to just say, okay, there was a discount on this football team or this hockey team, therefore we should apply that to this basketball team or baseball situation. While guys like Lyle and myself, like to use precedents and we do rely upon them, I think the unique nature and the bespoke nature of pro sports ownership require a little bit more nuance.
Gotcha. And another word that's come up a lot over the past couple of panels, expansion. A lot of fans love to talk about it. Adam even addressed it at the beginning. How do you think about, expansion and how that might affect, valuations moving forward as well?
Well, look, what's fascinating to me, and I'll go to other leagues for a second, is where expansion teams are worth more than teams with an existing operating history and a history of winning, right? So in the NHL, for example, there was just 2 expansion deals over the last couple of years that were mentioned earlier. I haven't done the math, but I'd be willing to bet that more than half of the teams in the NHL aren't worth what those expansion teams are worth, right? And it might be significantly more than half. MLS, same thing, potentially. In the NBA, I don't know where those expansion fees will end up if and when they do expand. You hear 2.5, you hear $3 billion. I mean, look at your valuations. If we take those at face value, a lot of the existing teams are worth less than the expansion fee. Now, there's a market size dynamic, et cetera, but it's a pretty interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, it's funny. Adam seemed to imply at the beginning of the event today that looking at our numbers, maybe $2.5 billion, the rumored, what an expansion fee might be if it happened now, that was low, that it even maybe should be higher as a result of seeing these numbers. I mean, if I told you guys you had an expansion team to sell in Seattle for $2.5 billion, could you sell that in like a week? Like what do you think the market looks like right now if the number is $2.5 billion?
I think Don would sell that in a day.
Is that right, Don? It's that quick?
No, look, I mean, it depends on the situation, and NBA is obviously not going to do anything that's not going to be platinum plated. And so, whoever the owner is going to walk into something that works, whether it's Seattle, Las Vegas, Mexico City, wherever you're talking about, you're going to end up with a built-in fan base that is there. For the other owners, it's just a matter of the dilution, right? And that's just math, right? We can figure that out. as to how much upfront proceeds they need to get comfortable with the math dilution, the financial dilution, but also understanding what does it mean to have a team back in Seattle. Like, for the folks that have been around this league for a long time, I think they get it that like the Seattle Supersonics are important from a legacy perspective, right? And there is obviously a massive market with a lot of wealth that right now the NBA is not servicing in a direct way, and so the long-term value of that beyond just the pure math of the dilution that these owners would have. I also think it's an interesting way of coming to some pure value what the value of buying an NBA franchise is, right? It's actually, from an exercise, it's very theoretical, and I'm not surprised to hear Adam say that he's talking $2.5 billion or higher, because you are effectively having the opportunity to buy, about a 3% stake in the NBA, and that shouldn't be a low number. That should be a very high number.
When you think about, you mentioned Mexico City there. Do you think the NBA is the first league we see with a team outside of the U.S. and Canada?
It's clear to me that the league that's best equipped to do it would be the NHL, right?
In Europe? Yeah,
in Europe, right? That makes all sense in the world, right? You could put probably 5-6 teams over there and figure it out from a scheduling perspective. I think the NBA is not going to be going to Europe anytime soon. Mexico City does make some sense. The problem is you've got Seattle, I would imagine, ahead of it, right? They've got a new building going up, and I have to think that you have to spend a lot of time thinking about Las Vegas, and then even maybe in Vancouver, right? And I know that's a little of a sore subject, but David Stern used to always say to me that was one of his biggest regrets. Was allowing a team to leave Vancouver. It's such a great market, and so while Mexico City would be really fun to think about, it does seem like there's some others that are ahead of it in line.
On the topic of international, a word that I would argue hasn't come up enough today: China. The league has been in a pretty public back and forth with China over the past 18 months. Obviously, it's the biggest international market for the NBA right now, outside of its home market. How does that affect? They're back on TV, I believe, now fully. How has that kind of affected the way you guys think about the valuation and maybe the interest from people in the NBA's long-term business?
Look, from my perspective, it doesn't affect the value. It's similar to COVID.
It's just a temporary blip.
Yeah, careful of making analogies between China and a global pandemic. But what I mean by that is it's a short-term issue that goes away. I don't think China has given up on the NBA, and I don't think China has given up on basketball. I think China was annoyed, with a comment that was made, and they flexed a bit. But I think if you were to look out, 3-5 years, I think it's all Sportico, and I think when you look at the valuations and the opportunity, that's the time horizon.
Yeah, short term. I think Eben, I think I was on your podcast and your previous employer. I don't know, it was a year and a half ago, and it was right when all the stuff was going on with Daryl. And I think at the time I said, on that day, the stock of the NBA would have been down 5 or 10%. But I also know that it would bounce right back. Right? There'd be a short-term shock to the system, but long-term, not an issue.
And we're back now at this point.
Oh yeah.
I think we wrote a story, Don. Thank you for that comment. We appreciate it when you make nice, newsworthy headlines.
There you go. Trying to help you out. Anyway,
you want to laugh though to show where we are and where we were. You mentioned David and his regret in Vancouver, and I remember that well. But I clearly remember I was on the flight with David and Russ Granick out to Vancouver in those league meetings. David found out about the proposed sale of the team by the customs agent. We didn't have a phone on the flight, so I was right behind him online, and then the huddle of David and Russ and Brian McIntyre at the time, and then the emergency press conference at the hotel in Vancouver. Just amazing where we were. and where we are. So, gentlemen,
it's funny, Scott, that you picked up from this last conversation on that tidbit that Don said about Vancouver, because that's exactly what I was going to mention as well. When I asked Adam way back, like 2.5 hours ago, it seems like 2 weeks ago, about the possibilities of expansions, and not just the price, but what city, Vancouver's what I had in mind, because obviously Seattle has been discussed a lot, but Vancouver really is a great market in terms of they already have the hockey team, obviously does very well, but in terms of geography, positioning, and so forth. So it's fascinating to me that's what you zeroed in on, because obviously the commissioner didn't bite and he said we're not talking about that right now, but I think that's a real possibility.
You're a good Canadian. Sure.
Yeah, full disclosure, he's a Canadian anyway.
Yeah, so if you couldn't pick up the faint traces of a Canadian accent yet, I have just outed myself.
Don and Lyle, thank you so much, guys. We appreciate it as always. Wonderful stuff, and we do appreciate you sharing it with our folks.
Right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
We want to thank everybody who was part of our program today. Commissioner Silver, Steve Ballmer, Wick Grossbeck, Mark Lasry, Ted Leonsis, Michelle Roberts, and of course our last panel, and Eben for joining us for a lot of these questions. I think that MBA valuations is such an incredibly dynamic topic. I encourage everyone to play with the Levinator, as Michelle has said she's already doing. And also check out, which I didn't mention in my demo, but check out the methodology that's listed both in the data visualization in the NBA valuations and in our NFL valuations, which came out in August, because both of them, with our commitment to transparency at Sportico, shows how the sausage was made, so to speak, and how we arrived at some of these numbers, both related to national revenues for the league as a whole, but also breaks out specific teams as well. So that's something I wanted to highlight for those interested as well.
Well, Peter, what I want to highlight is my takeaway that Ted seemed to think that everything you did was wrong. So,
yeah, well,
which I appreciate. I like Ted taking a holistic view of the industry and what the possibilities are. I really enjoy, and I mean that. I really enjoy.
I don't really know how short term it could be low and long term it could be high if he's also saying at present it is too low, but regardless, I love his enthusiasm. I also think that I really wanted to get into which he only touched upon, growth abroad, which is something that the Wizards are really emphasizing. A lot of these other teams are doing it. Of course, we discussed how the league is doing it, but teams that can make their own businesses in foreign markets are really going to be a step ahead of all the others.
Well, almost every owner mentioned having people in the seats or not having people in the seats and how it affects revenue. Next week, Sportico Live is back with our friends over at Arctos Sports Partners. We will be discussing the return of fans to arenas, how to get it done, what are the plans, is it safe to do, when will it be safe to do? Among those scheduled to appear, get this lineup, Peter, if you thought today was good, ready? Joe Lacob, owner of the Warriors. Mark Lasry again joining us, co-owner of the Bucks. Tim Lywicki of Oakview Group. Dr. Celine Gounder, a member of President-elect Biden's task force on COVID. Jerome Pickett from Clear. Jessica Gelman, CEO of Craft Analytics. And Jamie Faulkner, the newly minted president of business operation of the Chicago Blackhawks. That is Thursday the 28th. Our folks at Arctos and Sportico taking a look at the return of fans to sports arenas. But thank you very much for joining us today on behalf of Peter and everybody else that took part. We hope you'd enjoyed it as much as we did and learned a little bit like we did. Thanks again.
Bye, everybody.